In the remote town of Pine Hollow, the forest that bordered the town was a place of fear and superstition. The locals call it the Whispering Woods, a place where the trees seemed to murmur in the wind, where shadows moved of their own accord, and where the dead were said to linger. No one ventured into the woods after dark. The townsfolk knew the stories of people who had disappeared without a trace, of strange lights flickering between the trees, and of blood-curdling screams that echoed through the night. These tales were passed down through generations, and though few believed them entirely, no one dared to test their truth. One autumn evening, a group of teenagers, Jack, Lily, Sarah, and Tom, decided to explore the Whispering Woods. They had grown up hearing the stories and were eager to prove that the legends were nothing more than old wives' tales. As they ventured deeper into the forest, the air grew colder, and an unsettling silence fell around them. The trees seemed to close in, their twisted branches forming eerie shapes against the darkening sky. Despite their bravado, a sense of dread began to creep into their hearts. As the group continued deeper into the woods, they came across an old, crumbling cemetery hidden among the trees. The headstones were weathered and broken, the names long faded. The place reeked of decay and abandonment, yet there was something oddly compelling about it. Hayes decided to explore the cemetery, laughing nervously as they made their way through the overgrown graves. But their laughter was cut short when a chilling scream pierced the air, a scream so full of pain and terror that it sent shivers down their spines. It was a scream that didn't belong to the living. They froze, looking at each other with wide, fearful eyes. No one spoke, but the fear was palpable. They all heard it, and they all knew what it meant. The scream came from somewhere deep within the woods, and it was calling them. The group debated whether to continue or turn back. The logical choice was to leave the woods immediately, but something drew them deeper, an inexplicable urge to uncover the source of the scream. They pressed on, the path before them becoming more indistinct with each step. The trees grew denser, their branches intertwining like a cage, trapping them in the forest's dark heart. The further they went, the more the woods seemed to change around them, as if the forest itself was alive, guiding them to their doom. The scream came again, louder and closer, reverberating through the trees. Jack, the most adventurous of the group, urged them to keep going, convinced that they were close to finding the truth. Reluctantly, the others followed, fear gnawing at them. But as they pushed forward, they realized they were hopelessly lost. The path had vanished, and the woods seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. Panic began to set in as they frantically searched for a way out. In their desperate search for an exit, the group stumbled upon a solitary grave marked by a single, crooked headstone. Unlike the others, this one was untouched by time, its inscription clear and fresh. "Here lies the scream of the dead." A chill ran down their spines as they stared at the grave, the implications of the words sinking in. This was no ordinary burial site. It was a place of darkness and malevolence, a resting place for something that should never have been disturbed. As they stood there, a cold wind blew through the trees, carrying with it a faint whisper voice from beyond the grave. The air around them grew heavy, and the scream echoed once more, so loud and piercing that it drove them to their knees, clutching their ears in agony. When the scream finally subsided, they realized with horror that the grave had been disturbed. The earth was freshly turned, as if something or someone had clawed its way out. From that moment on, the group was no longer alone. They could feel it, a presence, watching them from the shadows, following their every move. It was a cold, malevolent force that seemed to seep into their very souls, filling them with dread. The forest, once merely unsettling, had become a nightmare. The trees whispered in a language they couldn't understand, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The path they had come from was gone, replaced by a maze of darkness and decay. They tried to run, but no matter which way they turned, they ended up back at the grave, the words on the headstone mocking them. The presence grew stronger, and with it, the screams returned louder, closer, and more desperate. The group began to unravel. Jack, once confident and fearless, was now shaking with fear. Lily clutched Sarah's arm, her eyes wide with terror. Tom, always the skeptic, was pale and silent, his disbelief shattered by the horrors they had witnessed. The screams intensified, no longer coming from the woods, but from within their own minds. The presence that haunted them grew stronger, seeping into their thoughts, twisting their memories, and filling them with visions of death and despair. Jack was the first to fall. One night, as they huddled together in fear, he began to mutter to himself, his eyes glazed and distant. He spoke of the dead, of voices that called to him, of a woman in white who whispered secrets of the grave. They tried to snap him out of it, but Jack was no longer Jack. He was possessed by something dark and ancient, a spirit that had risen from the grave, using him as a vessel for its rage. It wasn't long before the others followed. Lily started seeing things, shadowy figures lurking just out of sight, a face in the darkness, watching her with hollow eyes. Sarah's dreams were filled with the scream, a sound that never ended, echoing in her mind until she couldn't tell where the scream ended and her own thoughts began. Tom, the last to succumb, fought desperately to hold on to his sanity. But the presence was too strong, and eventually, he too was consumed by the darkness. With their minds broken and their souls tainted, the group became puppets of the dead. The spirit that had risen from the grave was no ordinary ghost. It was something far more sinister, a being of pure evil that had been buried for a reason. The spirit needed something from them, something they could only provide by entering into a pact that would bind their souls to the forest forever. In their madness, they agreed, not fully understanding the consequences. The pact was sealed with blood, and as they cut their palms and let their blood drip onto the grave, the forest came alive with a terrible power. The screams became deafening, a chorus of the dead, rising from the ground to claim their souls. The earth beneath them shook, and the trees twisted and writhed as if possessed by the same evil that had taken hold of them. As the pact was sealed, the grave burst open, and from it rose a figure draped in tattered, blood-stained robes. It was the source of the scream, the spirit that had been trapped in the earth for centuries, now free to walk the world once more. The figure was no longer human. Its face was a ghastly mask of death, its eyes hollow and lifeless, and its mouth twisted in a perpetual scream. It reached out to them, and they were powerless to resist, their bodies moving of their own accord as they were drawn into its embrace. One by one, they felt their souls being torn from their bodies, absorbed into the spirit's essence. The pain was excruciating, a burning agony that seared through their very being, but they couldn't scream. Their voices had been stolen, their cries silenced. With the group now bound to the spirit, the curse that had once plagued the forest was unleashed upon the world. The dead were no longer content to remain in their graves. They rose from the earth, driven by an insatiable hunger for the living. Pine Hollow became a place of horror. The townsfolk, who had once feared the Whispering Woods, now found themselves hunted by the very spirits they had long tried to avoid. The dead roamed the streets, their screams filling the night, their eyes empty of life, but filled with a burning hatred. The group, now fully possessed, became the spirit's enforcers, carrying out its will with ruthless efficiency. They were no longer human, their souls twisted and corrupted by the evil that had claimed them. As the town fell into chaos, a small group of survivors gathered to make a final stand. They were led by Father O'Malley, the town's priest, who had always suspected that the forest held a dark secret. Father O'Malley knew that the only way to end the curse was to destroy the source of the grave where the spirit had been buried. But getting to the grave meant going through the Whispering Woods, a journey that few had ever survived. With the dead closing in, the survivors made their way to the forest, armed with whatever weapons they could find. Father O'Malley carried a crucifix and a vial of holy water, praying that it would be enough to protect them from the evil that awaited. The final confrontation took place in the heart of the Whispering Woods, at the grave where it had all begun. The spirit, now fully resurrected, stood before them, its eyes burning with malevolence. Father O'Malley led the charge, reciting prayers as he splashed the holy water on the ground. The spirit recoiled, hissing in fury, but it was far from defeated. The group fought with all their might, but the spirit's power was overwhelming, its screams tearing through their minds, driving them to the brink of madness. Just when all seemed lost, Father O'Malley managed to reach the grave. He plunged the crucifix into the earth, and with a final, desperate prayer, he called upon the power of God to banish the spirit once and for all. The ground shook, and a blinding light erupted from the grave, engulfing the spirit in its radiance. The spirit screamed, a sound so terrible that it shook the very foundations of the earth, but it was too late. The light consumed it, tearing it apart, until there was nothing left but silence. The ground shook, and a blinding light erupted from the grave, engulfing the spirit in its radiance. The spirit screamed, a sound so terrible that it shook the very foundations of the earth, but it was too late. The light consumed it, tearing it apart, until there was nothing left but silence. Pine Hollow was forever changed. The town, once full of life, was now a place of mourning, its streets empty, its homes abandoned. The memory of the dead lingered, a ghostly presence that would never truly fade. The survivors knew that they had only just managed to contain the evil, that the spirit could rise again if the grave was ever disturbed. They sealed the cemetery, placing wards around the grave, and vowed to keep the secret of the Whispering Woods hidden. But in the dead of night, when the wind blew through the trees, some claimed they could still hear the faint, distant echo of a scream, a reminder that the dead were never truly at rest. And so, the story of Pine Hollow became another tale of fear and superstition passed down through generations. A warning to those who would dare to venture into the Whispering Woods, for in the heart of the forest, the dead still lingered, their voices forever trapped in a scream that would never end.